Well, while she's just getting setting up for Sioux Falls, coffee and pastries over on the counter. Feel free to help yourself. Restrooms are down that first hall if you need that as well. And so, welcome to SDPB here in Sioux Falls. We also have about a dozen in Rapid City watching on a big screen and about 50 online. So that's the tech that we're just making sure everybody is having access to the same thing. Even though the speakers are all here in Sioux Falls, people are joining from multiple ways across the state. So I always have a good idea in theory that it's all going to go smoothly. So this is also going to be streamed on the SDPB YouTube channel. That's where it's going to be archived. It's also on Facebook Live on the SDPB News as well. So if you want to access it and share it from Facebook, you may. And then also on SD.net, our open government site too. So lots of ways. We decided if we're going to be talking about open government, we should be truly transparent. So, and that's what they're making sure is all rolling at once. So just give us one more minute. So for those online and in Rapid City, let CJ Keene know your questions, and he's going to text them to us, to me. Online, you're welcome to text questions to me at any time at 605-204-0204. David, can you share your screen now, please, to make sure that that's going to all of the places it needs to go? And they're just testing that real quick, David, so hang on. Okay, we're good to go. I think everything is set. Again, any questions? If you are in the Sioux Falls studio, please come to this mic if you have questions. Otherwise, please text me your questions. 605-204-0204. 204-0204. So with that, welcome to our open government. I'm going to turn it over to Dave Bordewick to do the introductions. Thanks for being here and all you do for the media.
Thank you, Kara. I appreciate it. Again, my name is David Bordewyk, Executive Director of South Dakota News Media Association, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the work that Kara as well as Carson from South Dakota News Watch did, and as well as South Dakota Broadcasters in organizing this morning's event. And thank you for attending as well. I'm really excited and pleased for our first speaker this morning, who I consider probably one of the nation's foremost experts on freedom of information laws, as well as how to access government information and how to navigate through laws, whether it be on the federal level or within our states. Let me just take a minute to introduce our speaker, David Coulier, and tell you a little bit about him before I turn it over to him. David is the director of the Joseph L. Brechner Freedom of Information Project and co-director of the Brechner Center for Advancement of the First Amendment at the University of Florida. Welcome to South Dakota virtually this morning, David. Before joining the University of Florida in last year, David taught access to public records, data journalism, and other courses at the University of Arizona School of Journalism for 17 years, where he also served as director of the school and director of graduate studies. He has published research on freedom of information and co-authored the books The Art of Access, Strategies for Acquiring Public Records, as well as Transparency 2.0, Digital Data and Privacy in a Wired World. He served as national president of the Society of Professional Journalists in 2013 and 14, as well as the SPJ FOI chair for 5 years. And he was president of the National Freedom of Information Coalition from 2019 to 2023. David currently serves on the Federal FOIA Advisory Committee under the National Archives and Records Administration and has testified 3 times before Congress regarding FOIA. Since 2004, he has trained more than 10,000 journalists and citizens on how to acquire public records. He got his start in public records as a newspaper reporter and editor in the Pacific Northwest for a dozen years before earning his doctorate in communications from Washington State University. David, welcome virtually again to South Dakota. We're glad to have you with you. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Great, Dave. Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for showing up on a Saturday. I hope the weather's warming up there in South Dakota for you. And I'm glad because we get to talk about a great topic, and I hope it's helpful for you. So I put in the chat, and I don't know if you saw 2 handouts. Feel free to snag those. I also emailed those to Dave, and he can distribute. All the stuff I'll be talking about will be in the handouts. The main handout's 70 pages, and then the slides is a handout, so you don't have to scribble furiously as I sling through these very fast, because I want to get through this stuff and let y'all time to talk and have questions and that sort of thing. So I was asked to talk about a couple things. One, the state of transparency in South Dakota, how it compares to other states around the country, and then some practical tips on acquiring public records. So I can't see the chat or questions as I go along. So we'll wait till I sling through this and jot down your questions as you have them, and we'll make sure to have time to talk about it. So let's get started, shall we? All right. So of course, this is what we all believe in. We're journalists. We know that access to public records is important for holding government accountable. And there's a lot of research that shows, for example, empirical research, that public record laws reduce corruption, right? Makes sense. Actually directly leads to cleaner drinking water because cities are on their toes when they're being looked at and scrutinized. Even restaurants are cleaner, serve better food, less likely to give you food poisoning because of this transparency of records. Sex offenders are less likely to reoffend because of the nature of the publicness. And parents, it's been found, are more likely to choose schools based on the records they look at of school performance. And so, in fact, for every dollar spent on public records journalism, society benefits $287. That's a huge return on investment. What you do with public records makes a difference. Saved lives, lower taxes, all of that really has a demonstrable effect on society. It's not just theoretical. Of course, it is about democracy, right? I mean, this is kind of the premise. It's our government, and journalists, we serve as proxies for the public and in finding out what the government's up to so we can kick them out of office if they're not doing a good job. So that's really what this is about, and it's so important. But unfortunately, it's not looking good out there. No, and you know it. You see it day to day. You see the decline in responses to your request for records or information. In fact, nationally, on average, 10 years ago, if you asked for a public record in the country, you'd get about half the time. Now it's down to 31% of the time. It keeps dropping every year. It gets worse and worse. And it's even worse on the federal level. I mean, look at that. 13% of the time you get what you asked for if you submit a federal FOIA request for a federal agency. Not cool. Not cool at all. And it varies by state, of course. And, some states are better than others. We find that Washington State routinely does very well. About 66 to 70% of their requests, you get something. That's still a D or C in my grade book, but, it is what it is. But look where South Dakota hits right there. Not too good, not too good. And this isn't just an aberration of my research. This is a assessment of Muckrock data. Muckrock sends thousands of records requests out across the country and tracks how they come out. And I analyzed that to get these numbers. It really pops out is when you look at the map, states in the South, deep South, not very transparent. And South Dakota is not joining them. So, it's getting close to joining them. And historically, South Dakota is rated low on various transparency scales. I collect these. I collect them like bottle caps, these studies. And man, look at that. In some studies, 3 of them, South Dakota is the least transparent in the entire country, the least transparent state in the entire nation. That's significant. That's not just a fluke. There's something going on. In fact, we did another experiment this spring. We asked state agencies in all the states, we asked for 7 different types of records. And South Dakota was abysmal. Their agencies were not helpful in providing these records to us. They rated it again at the bottom. When you look at across the country, really only got 1 out of 7 requests. Very frustrating. So what do we do about it, right? And who's going to defend our democracy? Well, shoot, our newsrooms have been slashed. Since 2005, we've lost 43,000 journalists in the country, about 60% of fewer journalists than there were 20 years ago. And you probably feel it in your newsrooms. And, we used to carry the banner for public records, sue for records when needed, but you just don't see that as much anymore. And that's really troubling. So who do we turn to? Do we turn to support, in training? Obviously journalists want more skills in public records access. In fact, a study 2022 showed it's the #1 thing journalists want training in, acquiring public records. I suspect it's because government agencies are more likely to ghost us, just not even return our calls. And so the only way to get information is through the public records law. So I'm glad you're here today to get some of that training and some of the good ideas. There are a lot of groups that have been around to try to fight for this and support journalists, but they're dying off if they haven't already died. Sunlight Foundation, dead. Sunshine Government Initiative, dead. News Leaders Association, formerly AS&E, going out of business as of this June 30th. SVJ's hurting. NFOIC's hurting. I mean, it's not a good landscape. It's not to be a bummer here, but this is just a reality. And there are things we could do in South Dakota and nationally. I mean, really what South Dakota needs and other states is mandatory fee shifting. If you sue for records and win, the government has to pay your attorney fees. You do that, and attorneys are more than willing to jump up and take a good case because they know they might get paid. We need stiff penalties, like in Washington State. That's why Washington State's pretty good. If you sue an agency there and you win, not only do you get your attorney fees, but up to $100 per day per record that they dink you around in penalties. That could lead to hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it has, almost bankrupting some towns like the town of Mesa in Washington State. So that would really help in South Dakota. South Dakota could use a strong coalition for open government. There are about 40 states that have these nonprofits that really push for open government, often started by journalism organizations, often press associations. And I'm just writing a study today, actually, when I finish this, that shows that states that have these are more transparent than other states. And of course, working on our fee provisions would help. We shouldn't be charged huge fees for records. There are records. We've already paid in our taxes for them to create them and maintain them, for us to look at them. So we shouldn't be charged all these fees for records. It's just it's a way to get people to go away is what it is. All right, so shoot, there's the state of access in South Dakota and around the country. Not good. So what can we do? What can you do to make things better? In addition to some of the things I just mentioned, just doing darn good journalism, requesting records day in and day out to keep the government honest. I mean, that in itself will make a huge difference. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about some tips, some ideas that might help you in acquiring these records, because I know it could be really frustrating. And the handouts I did put in the chat earlier, and two handouts, one, these PowerPoint slides, and two, this set of tips, tricks, and tools for acquiring records. 70-page handout. All the things I'm going to talk about are in there, all the details. So you could refer to that at your leisure while you're sitting there watching Netflix or something. Just kind of peruse through there, and you'll get some ideas there. And basically, we break it down into 6 steps that are important in this process. And I'm just going to gloss over them because we don't have a lot of time. I want to leave time for questions, but just give you a sense of how to really ramp up your reporting. One is just to think about documents, get it a document state of mind. Be thinking about what data is already out there that you could download and use. And there's a ton of it. Census data, worker safety data, OSHA data, down to the actual company or location, plant in South Dakota. You can see who has the most worker, injuries. And that's all online. You can just download it. And in the handouts, I list a bunch of great databases that you can download that are federal, and you can parse out for your state or your community. So it's right there. You don't even have to submit a public records request. I encourage reporters to think creatively about types of records. It's not just paper documents or PDFs or even data. It includes audio and video. So a reporter in Boise heard rumors of the mayor using the city credit card to buy personal stuff, and the mayor denied it, of course. And so the reporter asked for the City Hall surveillance video recordings, looked through it all, and found video of the mayor with the fire chief, his administrative assistant, and the PR person hauling in loot from Costco into his office, TVs, fireplaces, whatnot. Caught him red-handed. And the mayor ended up going to prison for that and some other things. So, think creatively about this. And you don't have to be a huge newspaper to do this, or working for a big organization. Bell City in California, a reporter looked at their budget, just see how they spend their money, and found the city council members paying themselves huge salaries, hundreds of thousands of dollars, total corruption. All anybody had to do was look. Now, it happened to be a LA Times reporter who did this, and they won the Pulitzer for this. But this could have been anyone in any small town. All it takes is someone to go look. So it's very powerful. And believe me, if you integrate this and build your public records muscles through exercising them routinely, you're going to get mighty powerful, and you're going to do great work and improve your communities. So that's the document state of mind. Now, second, you want to know the law, right? And you have some great experts here in this gathering today who are going to talk about the law in detail in South Dakota. So I'm not going to cover South Dakota law in detail. Of course, there's federal FOIA for federal agencies. And we know that most local journalists don't use federal FOIA that much. We don't cover federal agencies a lot. Sometimes we do, right? I mean, there's, Bureau of Land Management or EPA or other groups that other organizations we may deal with as journalists, but typically we don't use federal FOIA. And frankly, federal FOIA is a pain. It takes years sometimes to get what you want, and it's a huge bureaucracy, but I wouldn't discount it. I would consider it. And if you do end up using it, I think the best site to really get to know how to do the right request letter and how to ask for expedited review and free fees, which you can get as a journalist, go to this page, FOIA Wiki. It's produced by the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and it explains in plain English all the nuances. If you get denied and they cite some exemption, this page explains to you what that all means and how you can appeal if they're using that appropriately. So that's the place to go for federal FOIA. As far as South Dakota law, again, I'll let Dave and these other experts here in South Dakota talk to you about that. They'll give you all the lowdown on how South Dakota's plays out in public records, and it varies by state. Every state's a little different. In fact, if you want to look at how other states fare, Reporters Committee also has an open government guide for an explanation of every state's public records law, including South Dakota, and you can compare different provisions in South Dakota law to other states. There's a compare function. It's really handy. You know, how are fees handled? What's the deadline? How are police law enforcement investigation records handled? All of that you can take a look and see in South Dakota and other states as well. All right, so number 3, this is the critical step: finding the records, identifying the records, so you know what to ask for. Because if you don't, often it's a fishing expedition that takes a lot of time, costs a lot of fees, doesn't go anywhere. And that's really important in this whole process. Like Jason Leopold.
So in order to get records, you really have to know what you're asking for. But in addition to that, really understanding how that agency functions. So for example, if you're asking the Department of Homeland Security for records about a protest or some kind of civil disobedience, it's really important to get an understanding of how big that agency is. So prior to filing requests, it's in the reporter's best interest to go through an organizational chart and really study it and understand where your request should be directed to.
So that's a tip from Jason Leopold. He goes by the name FOIA Terrorist nickname. That's actually the name the FBI gave him because he asked for so many records and he's so good at it. So, and I had asked him, what's the #1 tip? And that's what he gave me. He's talking about really learning what the agency's all about, what they do, and all the records that record what they do. And that requires just shoe leather reporting, going down to the agency, talking to people in person if you can, and really figuring out what they do, scouring their website. That's how you're going to get a bead on records that you can go after. Now, sometimes you want to go and talk to government employees and they'll tell you, oh, I can't talk to you. The mayor, the city manager said, you have to go talk to the public information officer. If I talk to you, I get fired. Well, that's illegal, actually. It's unconstitutional. Government agencies can't prohibit their employees from talking to you. And there's several studies, law review papers that lay this out. I'm happy to share that with you all if you want. In fact, we have a paper going out Monday on this very issue with police agencies that punish police officers for criticizing the department. That's unconstitutional, yet 3/4 of police agencies do that around the country. Chances are that they probably have such policies in your area, and don't believe them. So if you run across that, question it, reach out. Happy to see, there's some nuances with it, but it's important to know you can talk to government employees. FOIA logs. So government agencies track all their public records requests. Otherwise, how would they know who to get stuff back to, right? So you can request those logs, and they give you a lot of great ideas for public records that you can request that someone else already has. Retention schedules. Typically, agencies are required to lay out how long they keep records and when they destroy them. That's public record. It gives you a long list of all sorts of different kinds of records they might have that you could look at. I think forms on government websites are great sources for ideas. Go to any government website, in the search page, type in form, and you'll get a list of all these different forms people fill out. Well, that information goes into a database. and you could take a look at that database. So I had a student find this form on the State of Arizona website for active violence reports that liquor control folks collected. This bar fights. And he asked for the database and got this database of bar violence in the state and looked at the most bar fightiest bar in the state and the town and trends over time and increase the use of weapons and guns and fatalities and that sort of thing. Really cool. And he came upon this just by finding a forum. And I really recommend becoming an IRE member if you're not already, because it gives you access to this IRE Resource Center online where you can keyword search all sorts of topics that you might be working on, to get tip sheets from IRE conferences going back decades, to get investigative stories done on the topic going back decades, thousands, 30,000 stories I think they've archived, all from their contest entries that you can look at, see what others have done, as well as other resources. It's a phenomenal resource. If you plan to embark on a topic that you're unfamiliar with, go here, learn what others have done and the tips they have for you and the records you can get and the angles and the sources you should contact. It's a great resource. And then I really want to point out Muckrock. It's a nonprofit which since 2010 has helped people submit public records requests all around the country. They're up to 135,000 requests that they've helped people with. And you can go to this website and all those requests, they're archived and keyword searchable. You can look at the actual correspondence between the requester and the agency, and you can see the records that were actually produced. Tons of ideas that you could get by going to that website and taking a look. And then lastly, I recommend ChatGPT. I've been playing around with it and it's kind of cool. It's better than a keyword search or Googling. You can ask it for all sorts of ideas on records on certain topics or certain agencies. And some of it's obvious, but I've learned some. And so yeah, this AI stuff can be useful in some ways. Check it out. Okay, step 4, place your order. All right. So you know the law, you document state of mind, you know what you want. Now you got to place your order. Now, of course, most of the time everybody says request. You submit a request. And I don't like that at all. I think it's the wrong way of thinking about it. You know, because when you say request, this is what you think of right there. That's a request. That's like, sir, may I have more records, please? And that's just not the right way to see it. I see it more like an order, you know? Now, I don't mean like being mean and I order you to give me this. I mean more like ordering a #1 meal at McDonald's, a Big Mac, you know? Maybe ordering up a library book at the library, or perhaps ordering some shoes on Amazon. Just you're ordering up records that you paid for with your taxes, that we all did, that they're holding on to for us to go look at. And we have to put an order in to look at them. That's all. And that evens the slate, evens the playing field. So we're not subservient to the government. And in fact, now they're filling out orders for us, not requests. So I encourage you to get in that kind of state of mind. All right, so you go about doing this, keep track of everything. Keep track of every person you talk to, what they say, whether it's on paper or in Excel or something else, because some of these can last years and you want to know what's going on. Muckrock actually lets you clone successful letters. So if you run across a letter that you think, wow, that's spot on, they have a button, you can actually copy it because it works. So that's another source. The Student Press Law Center lets you craft public record letters really simply. And this tool's been around for decades and it's very effective. I've run 2 experiments to found this letter is the most effective letter than anything out there. More effective than a friendly letter or a neutral letter. It's just really useful. In your letters, you want to be specific, as most specific as possible. Exactly what record you want, how you want it, how far back, you know, just very specific, especially if you're looking for emails. You want to cite the law. You want to maybe ratchet, which means start small. if you're interested in the mayor's emails, don't say, I want all the mayor's emails for the past 5 years. It'll take forever for them to go through them. It'll cost a lot of money. And then when you finally get them 2 years from now, they may be all blacked out and useless anyway. So instead, say, hey, can I get the mayor's emails from Tuesday? And okay, all right, that's easy for them to process, quick. You get it fast. Probably won't be charged fees. And if they give it to you all blacked out, then you can go back and haggle and negotiate. And then once you get something that's satisfying, go back and say, okay, how about the past month then? All right, how about the past 6 months then? And that's called ratcheting. And it can save you a lot of time and heartache, and save the agency time and heartache as well. So that's a good tip. All right, getting toward the end here. The next thing is overcoming denials, because shoot, I bet every one of you have run into denials, and we want to apply some psychology here, some Jedi mind tricks to get them to give you the record, right? Because what we're finding is the most common response now is no response, silence, ghosting. And that's really aggravating. They're just ignoring us more and more than ever. They're not even saying no. And that's called a constructive denial. They're saying no by not saying anything. And that's really frustrating. Sometimes they give us the runaround, and that's also irritating. And that's growing. The response of, we have no records responsive to your request, is on the rise. And that can be really irritating. Of course, we get a lot of records back that are just blacked out. They're saying, oh, it's secret, you can't have it. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not. You can't trust them. And sometimes we just get the weirdest responses, right? Like, patient veterinarian confidentiality and stuff like that. And just some crazy things coming up through the years. Now we could get mad, and we can yell and jump up and down and want to bash down that castle wall, get those records. But I recommend approaching it like a maze. You run into a roadblock, turn around, try another route. Just keep at it. Be persistent. Don't walk away. If you do that, they're emboldened. They'll continue to dink people around. So that means appealing. If they turn you down, submit another letter saying, hey, I'd like to formally appeal and have you reconsider, please. At the federal level, this is an actual process for free. States typically not, but why not do it? You could informally do it, send it, CC the city attorney, and if they look at it and say, hey, well, yeah, I guess that's public, give it to them. It cuts the records loose about a third of the time. It's worth it. And then, of course, we're dealing with people, so there's a lot of psychological tactics, which I have in the handouts. You can take a look at all the details. This is based on research, ways you could get people to give you what you want. So it seems a little manipulative at times, but this stuff works. There's several experiments that show peer pressure works with agencies. If you say, hey, Rapid City gave me this, why won't Sioux Falls? Is Sioux Falls not like as good as Rapid City? Is that what's going on here? And so, get the records from one agency nearby or a competing agency type of thing, and then go to the other one once you get the records. Very effective. Authority always wins out. That means letters that are strongly worded, depending on your relationship with the source. Maybe a letter from a lawyer, maybe teaming up, journalism organizations teaming up to get records. I call that a watchdog pile. And we're seeing more of that today, very effective. So authority wins every time. And still, even then, you may have to take off the gloves, go up the ladder, try another agency. I always like to put in an order for all the communications about my previous orders. And if you do that, sometimes that really scares them because they realize what they just put in an email about you. In the handouts, I have 10 tips for eliminating search and copy fees. Check that out. And then, of course, write about it. A lot of journalists think it's inside baseball to write about denials, but it isn't, right? Like, I mean, if the mayor gets a DUI, you're going to write a story about it. They broke the law. Well, what's any different with breaking state public records law? They're breaking the law. Tell everybody. They're not saying no to you. They're saying no to everybody in your circulation area. And you should tell those folks. There are folks out there that you can call and they'll give you bombastic quotes. I do it all the time. I love to give quotes, because I know you can't say the mayor or school superintendent is a ignorant communist, but I can say that. So you can quote me saying it, and giving you national context on how this place compares to other areas. So there's a variety of folks out there you can reach out to, including in South Dakota, and they'll tell you today, I'm sure, their contact information and what they're willing to do for you. Finally, consider court. I know sometimes it's up to your bosses and they don't want to sue because of the money involved. If you're a freelancer or you have flexibility, I would consider it. It's, a possibility. There are resources out there that could help you pay for your court costs. You have filing fees. So look to them, the resources. There are people who may help you, like the Reporters Committee. That's important. In fact, you could even sue pro se, although avoid setting bad case law. But if it's a slam dunk case, you can file your own court, claim, like Jorge Rojas did. He was a sophomore at Arizona State. He sued the FAA 4 times on his own, and won, because they denied him records, and he did it as a college student. So it is doable. I wouldn't rule it out, but I would, talk to some experts and folks before you do. Finally, just do it. And, what I recommend is set aside 1 hour a week when you're the least busy, shut everything off, shut off your email, your phones, whatever, and submit a public records request. Do one a week. Follow up on your other orders. And if you do that, that's 52 orders a year. And if you get great stories out of just half of them, that's 26 kick butt stories that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And it does several things. You get better at it the more you do it. And you start training your agencies to respond to these. So it's not out of the blue and weird. So they just routinely go, oh yeah, there's Dave again, putting in another order. Okay, here we go. But we'll give it to him because he's tenacious and doesn't let up. So if you do this one thing, it will completely change your reporting. I guarantee it. It will propel what you could do for your community by far. Feel free to reach out to me if you want. Happy to talk, give more tips if you run into problems. Give you facts of research on any of these topics that have been conducted across the country. Quotes for your denial stories, you name it. Happy to help if you like. And then just do it. Order up. And so with that, let's entertain some questions and discussion.
David, thank you. Excellent presentation. And I love your images and memes in your presentation this morning. That's very good. Well done. Very clever. One of the things I wanted to mention as far as where to look for tips and for ideas for stories and investigative tips is, and maybe you include this in your handout, are the public notices that are published in newspapers, such as school board minutes, bid notices, budgets, and so forth. I think they're sometimes overlooked, but all that information, particularly in South Dakota, we have lots of laws regarding notices that are required to be published in newspapers, and oftentimes that can be an excellent resource for finding out information or getting story ideas to go with it. So with that, let's open it up for a question or two. If anyone wants to chime in here before we let David go. Anyone?
So in South Dakota, SDPB is a state agency. And so we have to tread a little lightly. But when you know something should be public because it's in statute to be public and you're still denied and you're denied on your appeal, what's next?
Well, I mean, I think you have to ramp up the heat. And in the handouts, you'll see the progression of different strategies, whether it's, going over their heads, whether it's writing about it, whether it's sending a strongly worded letter from an attorney, and ultimately suing. I mean, if they're illegally denying the information, that's the sort of thing you should be able to pursue. But public shaming is very effective. Particularly think about who they care about the most. Public universities care about donors and legislators. So be targeting the stories toward them. Quote big donors, quote legislators, reach out to them. That's what scares universities is bad press. So whatever this agency, whatever they care about, a key lawmaker, certain public constituencies, make it about them, and make it more fearful for them to say no to you than yes. And there are a lot more other of those psychological strategies in the handout as well.
Thank you. Other questions? Someone else had a question. I think.
So you mentioned gigs on government employees informing on their agency as unconstitutional. Is that all levels of government? Like, is it just federal, or is it like state, city, any level of government?
It's all levels of government. Yeah, and I'll put in the chat before I leave a couple law review articles that lay this all out. There's actually a case pending in Pennsylvania on this very thing that various reporters committee and others are trying to make an example of an agency for doing this and make it clear that this is illegal. So until we get some hard examples, government folks aren't going to take it seriously. That's the strategy I call heads on pikes. You have to make some examples and to scare other agencies into following the law. But I'll put a few articles in the chat that will that discuss this more in detail.
Thank you. Next question here.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm one of the government folks, and I'm here to help you.
Great.
That is my job. As a government employee, that is my job to help you. It is my job to help you find the records to tell the stories. And I don't mean just your narrative or whatever it is that you're working on. But if you would like a document, I would like to help you find that document. And it is a cloudy day, as you mentioned, when every single government employee does not have that attitude. And that should not be something that is blocking journalists, the public, from information. Access to information is guaranteed in the Constitution, and it is a right that we need to fight for every day. So thank you for bringing that fight. I'm here for it. And so I just wanted to send out that encouragement and energy into the universe and hope that you discover that at every point in your journey instead of the exact opposite. Because when you are encountering that, my question for that government agency, whether it's the office specialist or the city manager, why are you even here? Why are you here if you are here to deny information to the public that they have a right to access? So thank you for doing what you do, and thank you all the journalists for doing what you do, and I will be here to help you unconditionally.
You're here.
And thanks for saying that. And by the way, yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about how to take on, it's a select few recalcitrant officials who flaunt the law. There are a lot of great people, particularly FOIA officers in government, who care. They wouldn't be a FOIA officer if they didn't, usually. So often they're told to not release something because someone doesn't want it out above them. And in fact, there's a case filed last month in Richmond, Virginia by a FOIA officer who was fired by the city for wanting to give out information that they were required to by law, but the mayor and city manager told her not to, and breaking the law. And so they fired her. She filed suit. All of it's laid out in the claim of all the techniques they used to hide information. Tell the reporter it's going to cost $5,000 in fees, they'll go away. String this out, delay it 2 years, they'll go away. All this is outlined. So, I rarely have any animosity for FOIA officers, the custodians. They are in a tough position. It's usually the ones above them sometimes who cause problems. Thanks for what you had to say, because there are so many people in government who care about this and understand the importance, and they need to be applauded for that.
Thank you, David. Now, one more question. Okay. All right. Lori?
You're perhaps seeing a theme here, but specifically what we're hearing from the PIOs is they're not going to respond categorically because they have other ways that they're getting information to people. So what would the next email be? If I say, why are you here? They say, well, you have access to the online database and the press releases, but that's all we're going to say. So how would you help elaborate on that, please?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think that's why journalists want training in public records, because that's the only way we're getting information anymore in a lot of places. PIOs, bless their hearts. Most of my former colleagues in newsrooms are PIOs now. So I get it. And they're just, again, doing what they're told to do. So we have to work around it. And that means submitting public records requests for email conversations about the topic you're interested in. It means developing relationships with other employees in the agency so that you're leaked information, so that you could find out what's going on, that you don't have to go through the PIO or the officials. Go around them. They're going to tell the employees, you can't do that. You'll be punished. You come back. Oh, really? What's the policy? I want to see it. Oh, look, this is unconstitutional. You're putting the agency up for a liability of being sued. So it's a lot harder now than it was 10, 20 years ago, no doubt. And that means we have to work a little harder to evade that spin control and that bunkering down that is hiding information from the public. It makes our jobs harder, but we have to stand up and do our best to get that information. Kudos to you all for in the trenches doing that.
This one is for David. I have several that came in to my text. How do you navigate asking for sensitive records in a small town where you know the city personnel and workers personally? I'm worried about getting myself shunned in the community.
Totally get that. I started working in my hometown weekly. My dad was the city attorney. I was in high school. I had to cover my dad. He didn't ground me once at all, but I understood covering, my friends. It's not easy in a small town. It was a town of 1,000 people, and so everybody knew everybody. So I understand that dynamic, and we can't let that fear stop our reporting. We have to, I think, come at it and treat people with respect and professionalism and transparency, so they don't feel we're tricking them or out to get them, gotcha story. And when people realize that, they still may not like the story, but if they realize, we have a job, and we're still not going to be the most liked people in the community. People are going to try to shoot the messenger. No one likes bad news. But it's what we signed up for, and we have to keep at it. I mean, what's the worst the city manager's going to do if you tick him or her off? Maybe not send you that press release about the new DARE vehicle. I mean, there are worse things. If we keep up our reporting and give people the information they need, even if we tick them off. We can keep at, I mean, they're already not giving us information, valuable information, voluntarily. So what harm is it going to do anyway? Probably, not an easy answer, but yeah, just don't let it bother you. Just keep doing the job because that's what matters.
A couple of questions from Rapid City. South Dakota state government now has a request portal that we must use to ask for anything. Is that illegal or unconstitutional? Is there any way this portal can be a good thing, or is it clearly a stall mechanism or deterrent, in your opinion?
Portals are interesting and they're becoming more common. On most state laws, you'll have to ask the experts here in your room for South Dakota, but most state laws, there's no requirement that you have to submit through a portal. The portal's an option. You could also submit an email request, order, or in some states you could ask verbally, and not in most states, but some. In some states, I've seen requesters submit their letter on toilet paper. So yeah. My guess, and again, they can correct me if I'm wrong, but South Dakota doesn't require you probably to submit through a portal. You could
They
submit
do
through
now,
other ways.
yeah.
My experience has been talking to some reporters and editors across the state in recent months is that it's been hit and miss in terms of agencies using that portal or directing requests to it. I think a good story idea in the coming months would be to do a FOIA request for what's been requested through the portal.
Yeah.
Find out how the portal's
I think
been
that's a
used.
great idea.
Yeah.
Well, what's the law say? It doesn't. My guess is the statute doesn't say you
No.
have to
No.
submit it. to the
No,
portal.
it's not in statute. Correct. Not in South
So
Dakota.
therefore, they can't require it, right?
Yeah, but it's all part of a bigger problem. Just as you alluded to, the ghosting that's going on, David, in South Dakota.
Yeah.
I mean, in recent times, it's just becoming much more of a frustration in terms of just FOIA officers and others just not simply responding to requests for information, or just basically saying, "Sorry, we can't talk. We have to send that up the chain," and it's just much
Missed
less flow of information, particularly from state agencies.
One more question. Are open meeting laws subject to nonprofits?
That's probably a question for our next session coming
Okay,
up here.
we'll save that one.
But for the most part, I mean, the general answer would probably be no for the most part there. But
And Florida has a First Amendment foundation, correct? With lawyers on call for journalists. How do we get that here? Is the last question.
yeah, great question. One resource I would point you to is our organization, South Dakota News Media Association. We obviously work a lot with journalists from our member newspapers across the state and news outlets who work with us. But someone you'll hear from later this morning, longtime attorney in South Dakota, John Arneson, who is our legal hotline attorney. And often I've had citizens who come to us with frustrations trying to access information in South Dakota or dealing with an open meetings problem. And oftentimes we've relied on or gone to John Arneson, our attorney here, to help that citizen with their problem or their access issue. And so I just would say, for short of a full-fledged nonprofit FOIA organization in our state right now, SDNA is probably your next best effort in terms of getting some resources there. David, we're running up against the clock here. We want to thank you very much for an excellent presentation this morning. Great information. Appreciate it very much. We've got your resources, the handouts that you provide, and we'll make sure we keep those available to anyone who wants to download those afterwards. But on behalf of all of us here in South Dakota, thank you very much this morning.
Oh, thank you, and thank you all for doing what you're doing. So important.
All right, thank you very much. We'll let you enjoy the sunshine down in Florida this morning. So thank you very much.
All right, yeah, I really appreciate David coming there. Good session, right? There's a lot of meat in there. Thank you for your comments. Appreciate it. Just want to make sure that his presentation, and then Crystal is going to download the Zoom, all the comments and everything that are going on right now. That'll be in the shared folder. And you folks from afar, and I think that's going on the screen. You can't see it here very well, but bit.ly and then / SD Open Government is the URL. But that QR code takes you to a shared Google Drive folder, and that's got the agenda in it. It's got David's presentation, and then I'm going to ask him to put those other legal documents that he mentioned there as well. Kind of do a search of everything that we talked about today. We'll try to put that in there as well. The next, Marty Jackley. His office has redone the handout. It's several pages long. It's pretty meaty. That digital PDF is also in that shared folder. And then what Kara and I are going to talk about later, the Vote South Dakota project, that effort, and that document is in there. So if you can't access it, you should be able to. We've never had a problem, but it's kind of vital because all of that stuff that he just went through, that's all available now too. So we didn't want to print it out. So you may bookmark that and look, because if there's any addendums, I'm just going to put them in there and just keep that archived as an ongoing basis there. So we're going to take just a couple of minute break. We let the break go long because we had good questions and everything. So figure if you need to go run to the restroom, those of you here in person, go ahead and do that. Get more coffee or donuts. Otherwise, about 10 o'clock, we got Marty Jackley, and David's going to be back with him. Thanks a lot for coming. working. Okay, is this working now? Okay, if you would gather again here, we're going to segueing into the next session here. This is the history of this goes back. Is that Larry Long when he was Attorney General? That there was an open records document that was years ago, and Dave was a part of that as well.
Open Records Task or Open Government Task Force.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
And that goes back to early aughts.
Yes.
Late 90s.
Yes.
That was well.
Yes.
And so this has been kind of an evolution of things. It went out of, we had a period where we did not have really access to it. It wasn't updated. And so this has been kind of one of those things that there are a lot of things on the, actually in the record or on the books in South Dakota. And so really appreciate Marty Jackley getting up here. He's got some events over here at the Attorney General of South Dakota, and then Dave Bordewijk with the South Dakota News Media Association. They're going to do a Q&A. Again, send your questions in just like we did with Kara last night there. We want to make sure that you from afar and on Zoom are a part of that as well. So we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A, but I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you, Carson. Appreciate it very much. So this is really a great treat for this morning to have the unencumbered time of the Attorney General of South Dakota for 45 minutes or so here. We really, what a treat, and we're blessed, and we're very thankful for you, Marty, for taking the time to come over and spend a few minutes with us this morning and talk about open meetings law a little bit, and maybe in other things as well. So, Marty has been Attorney General prior, and I was back in office, and but he's been really good in terms of working with journalists in South Dakota. I think over the years in terms of understanding our issues and some of our frustrations and what we deal with in terms of access to records as well as open meetings. And so we've been very appreciative, I think, over the years. I know over the years in terms of what he's done, as well as he has really an excellent PIO on his staff, Tony Mangan. I know many of you know Tony, and he does an excellent job as well. We're going to start this morning spending a few minutes talking about this, which is the South Dakota Open Meetings Law brochure, which was recently updated, and it was just, I think, a good time to highlight that. And I want to thank Tony from your staff, as well as Deputy Steve Blair, who really put a lot of time in updating this and getting this in its current format, and appreciate the work that they did in getting it to where it is. So thank you for them for doing that. So, Marty, so tell me, why the Attorney General and the Open Meetings Law? Why the correlation? Why is it your office or your position that gets involved with this?
Certainly, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. You guys always treat me fair, and I appreciate the partnership we had in putting out the brochure, and it really was a partnership. Why the Attorney General? I mean, some of it goes back to state statute. Some of it goes back to logically the Attorney General should be the one that gives the legal advice to the client of when they have some opportunity or requirements to do things. I think in part too because the Attorney General is responsible for enforcement of criminal laws, and when you look at some violations, it would flow to the state's attorney and then the Attorney General. I think it's logical too because when Larry Long was Attorney General, he formed the Open Meeting Commission, which the Attorney General appoints to, and I think for all those reasons, it makes sense that the Attorney General should be the one, at least from the state government standpoint, that the public can go to if they have a transparency issue or an open meeting question, or local boards and commissions. And so I think that's why it flows to the Attorney General.
Thank you very much for that. I would also point out on the Attorney General's website, there is a drop-down tab there that under the Legal Resources tab that has lots of great information about the Open Meetings Law, the work of the Open Meetings Commission over the years, the decisions that they've rendered, as well as the text of this brochure that's on that site. And so it's a really good resource for open government in South Dakota under the South Dakota Attorney General's website, and I would urge you to consider that when you're looking for information related to the Open Meetings Law specifically. So this brochure, which was a collaboration of our organization as well as Attorney General's office, has been around for several years, but it just had gotten to the point where it needed some updating and cleaning up in terms of the information that was in it. And particularly the really good, useful information in this brochure is, besides the recitation of all of the statutes under the open meetings chapter that are in here, is a Q&A that goes along with it. It really is, I think, just the helpful, useful portion of the guide in terms of explaining in sort of layman's terms how the open meetings law works and what sort of some key things to know, both as whether you're a journalist or just a citizen who's interacting with a public agency or has questions about a public meeting or official meeting. And so I think it's just a really, really good, useful tool, and I would point you to it. If you have any questions about where to get it, how to get it, please let me know. We'd be happy to get copies of it to you as well. And but it is on the Attorney General's website. So let's start with this, Marty, before we open it up, because I want to get a lot of Q&A and get some questions from the audience, because I'm sure there will be lots of it. But let's start with what constitutes an official meeting under the law, under the open meetings law. When is it that the open meetings law comes into play?
Certainly. First of all, you have to look at who's involved, and it has to be the state or a political subdivision of the state. And there's some exceptions to that. The UJS, the court system, isn't a part of it. The legislature's excluded themselves out. So you look at, is it the state? Is it political subdivision? Then you look at, is there a quorum? And if there's a quorum, and this is oftentimes the mistake that I sometimes hear, well, we didn't make a decision, we just discussed it. Well, if it's a political subdivision of the state, it's a quorum, and you're discussing official business or you're making a decision on official business, then these laws apply.
So, okay, we've got a 7-member city council. 5 of the members are in the car. They're driving to Pierre for a meeting that day. Is that a official meeting?
Depends on a couple things. What are they discussing? If they're discussing about when their next meeting is, probably not. If they're discussing official business, then in all likelihood, I think it probably qualifies. Again, it depends upon what is discussed. We've taken a position at the Attorney General's office. If it's just simply trying to schedule something, those type of things, routine, nothing of substance, then we've designated as not official. But again, if it's even close and there's a discussion of doing business, it doesn't have to be making a decision, but a discussion, then I take the position it is.
Okay. Thank you for that. We had a question earlier about is a nonprofit organization that perhaps receives government funding or has some government resources coming into that nonprofit, are they subject to the open meetings law?
Generally, no. When you look at what the statutes talk about, they say the state or a political subdivision. They're not a political subdivision. You talk about task, if a task force is advisory only, they're not considered it. So no on the nonprofits unless it would somehow fit into a category of really doing the subdivision of the state's business, which would not normally be the case.
So the law talks about entities that, public entities, agencies that exercise sovereign power, sovereign authority. What is meant by that? That they fall under the open meetings law? What I mean, and I think I know the answer to it, but I just want to have you talk about that a little bit.
Sometimes, and it goes back to England. We talk about sovereign power, sovereignty. It's the king. If the king was making a decision, the king is sovereign. You have sovereign immunity if you are making decisions as the king. And so if you talk about sovereign power, I mean, sometimes I think you equate it to if it's government action, if you're using government taxpayer dollars, if you're doing government power, then it's a sovereign act. And I think really what in the cases that the Open Meeting Commission's talked about, or the ones that we get on duty day, and I should probably tell you at some point what duty day is, we always say we have to look at what the entity is doing. I mean, so many of the questions are with a task force. If they're just a task force assigned to study something, they're not really exercising sovereign power. They can, depending upon what the task force is doing, but that really goes back to if it's government, if you're making government decisions based upon government authority and you're spending taxpayer dollars, then that's that sovereign power.
you know, to that question about task forces, one of the changes made to the law several years ago, and I think it was an important one, is if an appointed committee or a task force is reporting back to the higher up, to the public agency board in a public meeting, saying, look, this is the results of our work as a task force. And oftentimes, and that's what I hear from journalists, it's the task force where the work gets done. That's where the nitty gritty is in terms of where that story is. But oftentimes that task force work maybe wasn't subject, they didn't do it in public because they're not subject to the open meetings law. But the change that was made to the law several years ago says that if that task force is reporting a recommendation to that governing board at a public meeting, that public board must wait until the next meeting to act on it. In other words, give the public time to react to what the task force is recommending for action. Just don't do it right on the spot, which I think is a good thing for the public. So back to the you know, notice about quorum of a board. They're just traveling down the road. They're going to an event, but they're not talking about official business. Oftentimes, what we've seen over the years, and I think a good thing has happened as well, is where public agencies have taken the step to say, look, we're posting a notice that we may have a majority or quorum of our board that's going to be present at this place at this time. Just be aware that they're going to be there, so that there's no doubt that, look, we're not discussing official business, but we may have a quorum there. And I think that's a good step as well, too. So,
I mean, the reality is in South Dakota, at every basketball game, football game in the high school, you may well have a quorum of county commissioners there, city council. It doesn't mean they're discussing official business, but I think the more that an elected official can put out there about what they're doing, the better. I mean, I've always counseled politicians and elected officials, the open meeting laws can be your best friend. If the public isn't guessing what you're doing and you're being open about sometimes hard decisions, I think the public accepts it better. I've found with the news media, if it's public and the news media is able to see it, you get better questions in the interview. It's more accurate reporting because the media could be a part of it. It just benefits everybody. The time that we get those duty day calls or the complaints to the commission, you know, sometimes maybe it isn't even intentional, but the fact that the public wasn't included brings up suspicions, brings up questions. There may have been some inaccuracies in the rumor mill because it just wasn't open. And I think so much of that's solved if you just, like you talked about, you say, look, there's going to be a group of us at this event, but we're not discussing official business or what have you. Just the more information that an elected official can put out, it oftentimes just protects that public official.
Yeah, and helps build that trust and transparency as well. Kara has a question here.
Two quick questions that have come in. One is 6 alderman council plus a tie voting mayor. If 3 council members and the mayor, does that equal a quorum?
What do the bylaws say?
Okay. So each is defined separately in the charter, right? City charter. Okay. And then we just saw terrible rankings for South Dakota when it comes to openness. What do you say? Do you agree or disagree with that assessment? And then what are you doing personally to make things more open? Good luck, it says.
Those are fair questions. So the one question that I have would be is who ranked it? In other words, who's doing the ranking and what do they base that ranking on? You know, I would say this, South Dakota can do a better job of transparency and openness. I've been a longtime voice that, especially on the law enforcement side, as long as you're not putting one of our officers in jeopardy by getting information out too early, so that if they're knocking on a dangerous door, I don't want word out so that the bad guys know that we're there. As long as you're not affecting somebody's right to a fair trial or process, and that is a controversial issue. Lawyers and judges and the media oftentimes disagree with that, but I would say as long as you're not affecting somebody's constitutional right to a fair trial, you know, generally, or you're not releasing, in my field, HIPAA or medical related information that, or juvenile information that's in violation of federal law, it's best to be transparent. But I just gave you a whole bunch of exceptions, and there's a lot of discretion in there. If you look at our laws in general, there's a lot of exceptions. oftentimes you hear, especially lawyers, talk about openness and that the way the laws are written, it says, we should lean towards openness, but then there's a lot of exceptions in those laws, and there's a lot of interpretations in those laws. If you look at that brochure, and it's not just me as Attorney General. I mean, Larry Long literally came from the media back in Martin before he was Attorney General. The Attorney Generals have taken the position, if it's a close call, we're going to side with transparency. It's part of the reason we have an Open Meetings Commission. It gives the ability, if the public thinks something went wrong, to give it to the state's attorney in a proper form, and then the state's attorney can either bring a criminal charge or send it to the Open Meeting Commission. So I think sometimes when there's these reportings, I don't know, I would want to know who's saying we're the worst and what criteria they're utilizing. But generally speaking, and we've worked, I think, well with back in the Newspaper Association. Now the name has changed, but we work with the lobbyists to try to have commissions to study this. One example, a few years back when I was Attorney General before, we brought what I would say a commission with too many bills, and we were juggling too many things, and we didn't get what we needed to pass, but we stuck with it. And now mugshots and other things became a part of that legislation. So sometimes it's baby steps. I would say in the part of doing the better job, the biggest complaints we get are executive session and whether or not there's proper notice on executive session, what happened in executive session. They can get kind of controversial. I think if by education, which is the importance of these brochures, to tell public entities, cite the statute number or say why you're going in, it would solve most of those complaints. But I talked to other attorney generals about openness. I don't believe we are the worst in the nation, so I'd like to see what entities saying that, what criteria you're using. But I'm also not saying there are some steps that we could take and we should take to make us more open. And I generally will support that as long as, again, you don't put a police officer in danger, you don't cost somebody a fair trial, and I don't get arrested by the U.S. Attorney for violating federal medical law or juvenile law. And I think one of those areas, too, the Supreme Court is pretty open in South Dakota. We opened, when I first became Attorney General, the trial courts a little bit more, but allowing one party to have a veto essentially over having certain things in the courtroom probably at some point needs to be revisited so that there can be a level of more transparency in the court systems. But all in all, I would say there's room for improvement, and I think when we have these task forces, that's an avenue to do that, because frankly, it makes it easier to pass laws with the legislature if you can say we had a task force that looked into this. That task force was made up of elected officials on the local government level, made up of the media, both print and video and audio. It had the Attorney General involved in it, state's attorneys, maybe an open commission meeting member. I think then the legislature takes a more serious look at it because there are a lot of exceptions in that law.
I totally agree. In my years of lobbying, my experience was every elected official is for transparency in government until you get to a specific issue that you want to try to get done, and then it's like, oh well, let's look at that further. So I've always, my experience has been the incremental progress has been our best path forward, and as Marty said, building consensus and bringing stakeholders together to work on a problem has been best. But also, most importantly, having leadership in positions that are able to carry these things forward are critical, whether it be in the legislature, in the executive branch, or in the Attorney General's office. We need to have people within those positions who get it, who are willing to carry it forward. In the past we have, and that's what it really takes in order to get progress done. I want to jump back real quick before we get off it to this question we had about the 6 alderman council with a mayor who cast votes only in tie situations. So, because I run into this often from newspapers, they say, look, they had three of the aldermen got together and the mayor sat in on it and they decided to do this, but they said it wasn't an open meeting because there was only, there wasn't a quorum there. And I often say, well, wait a minute, the mayor can vote, right? In tie situations. So I take the position that's 4 of the 7, that's a quorum. Am I wrong on that? Am I going too far on that?
And I didn't mean to be flippant on it, but I mean, legally the answer is what do your bylaws say? Because if you look at different sets of bylaws, some are going, they should a well-written set of bylaws should define what a quorum is. I just went through bylaw revisions with Jack Marsh, so you can imagine, those of you know Jack, I have the utmost respect for him. He's a very thorough man. And they should be defining that for you. If they don't, then you're back to Robert's Rules of Order and some other things. But generally, you need to go to the bylaws. And if the hard question is what happens if the bylaws are silent on what a quorum is? Then the lawyer is probably going to say, if it's a situation where the mayor actually voted, or was involved in the discussion, then I think you're right. And then I think you had a quorum, and you probably have a problem if you didn't have the proper notice. Of course, we all know, depending upon whether it's a state agency or the subdivision, it's the 24-hour posting, it's the putting it on the website. You know, the other question we get all the time is, okay, it was posted, they met the posting requirement, but then all of a sudden the meeting convenes and they change the agenda and make it a final agenda by adding something that wasn't on that before. Well, I mean, the law allows some of that to go on the way it's written, and I think some of it's a functionality deal. And again, I counsel, you know, if you knew about it and you knew it was going to be an issue, you should put it on the agenda. You shouldn't try to slip in that last minute and say, oh, I have one more agenda item. I just think that causes problem. But at the end of the day, it's probably not an open meeting violation.
Yeah, okay. We got a couple good topical questions coming here, but I want to get to a couple things specific to open meetings law first. One deals with serial discussions by public officials of a board that are done by email or text about official business. Are they violating the open meetings law or not?
My position of Attorney General is, and you have to look at what they're talking about. If they're just setting a meeting, no. But if they're doing anything of substantive nature, I consider it a violation. Because if you look at our statute, they talk about telecommunications, and I think that when you look at all of that, if in fact it's a quorum, I mean, you always got to have that quorum, then yeah, it's official business, and you have to do the proper notice.
Okay, thank you.
And again, it's always discussing it. It's not just voting on it. Oftentimes I'll talk to a public official, well, we were okay because we only discussed it. And I'm like, well, that triggers it. You have to do the proper notice, you know, and I know the challenge I always have is, okay, this has happened, right? They call in the office. Their duty day is what we have at the Attorney General's office, which some poor lawyer every day of the week gets assigned every phone call. That could be a murder case. That could be an open meeting violation. For me, the first time I did it as Attorney General, because that'd be a good idea, literally was a dog got shot on Grey Goose Road, and what was I going to do about it? So it can be a variety of things, but we get those calls in, and it's completely after the fact. And normally it was unintentional. So this goes back to, you know, one of the best things probably the Attorney General and others can do isn't necessarily always changing the law, but educating. It's what this brochure does. It's what this group meeting does. It's to educate elected officials, oftentimes in small towns that are not intentionally doing this, but they're clearly violating what the rules are. I think if you teach them the rules and make sure you emphasize it's not just voting on something, it's discussing it, I think you do away with a lot of those violations and you create a lot more openness.
One more question here before I jump into a couple that come on from the audience here. The law talks about posting of agendas at least 24 hours in advance to a regularly scheduled meeting. But the instances of special meetings or emergency meeting, the law also talks about that the agency shall take steps to notify local journalists who've asked to be notified of that emergency meeting or special meeting as best possible. And so we often recommend to journalists who say, wait a minute, they didn't notify me of that emergency meeting in my town. Well, did you tell the agency that you wanted to be requested of those emergency meetings? Well, no, I didn't. Well, our response often is, at least annually, let your local agency, school board, city council, county commission, whatever it may be, that you wish to be notified of every special emergency meeting. Am I correct in that? Is that a good practice?
Absolutely. It just avoids the potential confrontation.
All right. Well, listen, a couple questions have come in from the audience online here. One that's dealing with a very topical issue, not specific necessarily to the open meetings law, but dealing with lack of public access to scanners to law enforcement, to emergency scanner traffic, the that are out there. For instance, here in Sioux Falls, recently, they made the decision that they're going to basically turn off the public access to their scanner traffic. Where do you see that trend? I mean, that obviously, from a journalist, a reporter, news gathering standpoint, that's sort of disconcerting, because now you have one less tool that you can use in order to find out what law enforcement's doing, or to find out about an emergency situation, special situation within the community.
So if you go back in time, I've been Attorney General 4 terms now. During one of my terms, we looked at it. Believe it or not, scanners it was a misdemeanor to own a scanner back a few years back, and everybody owned them. And so we actually passed a law that says now you can own them. And so I think that was a step in the right direction. Some of the challenge law enforcement has with some of the reporting that has been done that can end up being in the newspapers or on scanners is we are releasing information that can arguably, depending upon what it is, be in violation of Marsy's law. We've had some other type complaints and concerns, and so I think that's why some of this is happening. You may reflect back, Marsy's law was that constitutional amendment. There were a lot of challenges on it. Initially, you couldn't even have a poor mom that a kid got involved in a car accident in a high school parking lot, couldn't get a police report to get collection of insurance. So we formed a committee. I think there was 17 or 18 people. It was too big of a committee, but we needed emergency action. And I issued ultimately 2 attorney general opinions on it. But we have had and then the legislature, I know they're not necessarily supposed to change the Constitution. Well, they're not supposed to change the Constitution, but they issued, at the cooperation of the Marsy's Law folks, statutory changes. Mark Mickelson was very active in that. So we've had some challenges with complying with the Constitution. So part of what's going on with the limitation of information is that law enforcement doesn't necessarily want to hide things. There is a concern that we're releasing too much victim-related information. There's always that concern I talked about earlier. I mean, Dave mentioned, some politicians always want to have openness until it affects them. I've always openly said, if it affects the safety of one of our police officers, I don't want that information out there. And you can have scanner traffic that may indicate, hey, we're about to show up here, and the bad guys know that. Now, that's pretty rare, but you can have those situations. You can control some of that too by, being smart about what you put out on the scanner and on the radios, but that's part of what's going on. And I would hope that at some point you're able to work with those local officials on what information can be out there with scanners. But that's just kind of the background on it. And I've been hearing more about the Marsy's Law, and I'll just be up front with you. People have asked me, Marty, when you were Attorney General before, you used to put the officers' names in your use of force analysis, and sometimes you don't anymore. And the reason is because of Marsy's Law. Sometimes the officer may be a victim, may not. I mean, if the officer was involved in an entanglement and was punched 3 times, they're a victim, and so they have a right to decide whether or not they wish to be public. And so it has brought, I think Marsy's Law has good intentions. It's been a good thing for victims in certain areas, but it has, on the transparency end, made it very challenging, because if we release information regarding a victim, whether it's in a scanner or otherwise, we are liable for that. And at some point, maybe that needs to be the further discussion, is does that need to be addressed either on a statutory amendment or going back to the Constitution?
But Marsy's Law is in the Constitution, correct? I mean, it's embedded, and so
which is, again, why it took a real serious problem for the Attorney General, who believes the Constitution should not be affected by an Attorney General opinion or a statute, to issue 2 Attorney General opinions. And then the legislature, that I think believes the same way I do, I know Mark Mickelson does, to pass a statute given some more clarity. I mean, you can issue Attorney General opinions and statutes for clarity, but at the end of the day, it's the South Dakota Supreme Court that needs to be interpreting the Constitution, not an Attorney General.
So on a related topic here, dash cam, body cam video of law enforcement. Where are we at in South Dakota with that? And I think you probably, Marsy's Law comes into play here, but maybe talk about that as well.
Yeah, Marsy's Law absolutely comes into play there. And of course, it depends on what's on the video. We've generally taken the position, It is up to the agency who owns the video as to whether or not they're going to release it. And so we leave that up to the chief, the sheriff, or the highway patrol. I'm in charge of the DCI. We rarely would have that type of information. Sometimes we do, but it doesn't necessarily affect our agency very often. So we've taken the position it rests with the agency holding the video. And I think that's generally across the United States what the law is.
Thank you. Other questions here?
I have one from Rapid City.
Okay.
And then I'll shut up.
That'll be fine.
My city has made several open meeting law violations. They're not concerned because all that can happen is a reprimand. The law appears not to have any teeth to encourage compliance. What should we do? A complaint was filed, is awaiting the Open Meeting Commission to act, but no action to date.
So what I would say is there's teeth, but you might question whether it's enough teeth. But if you violate, it has to be intentional. But if you violate the open meeting laws, it's a criminal misdemeanor. It's a class 2 misdemeanor, so it's up to 30 days. So I guess if I were a county commissioner and I were sitting in jail for 30 days, I would think it has some teeth. Now, when it happens, but it has to get to the proper authorities. And so the way it works, if there's a violation, it needs to be taken in the first instance to the state's attorney. I mean, the state's attorney is the entity under statute that receives the complaint. The complaint needs to be essentially tell us what happened, and it needs to be notarized. Then the state's attorney can do really a couple of different things. The state's attorney can bring a criminal charge and hold those people accountable in a criminal courtroom. Or the state's attorney, if it doesn't have any validity in the state's attorney's mind, can dismiss it. Or the state's attorney can send it to the Open Meeting Commission. And we've talked a little bit about that commission today, but we've revitalized that commission. So that delay that the writer's talking about probably is unfortunately true. We had a situation where maybe there wasn't as much priority on the Open Meeting Commission that should have been there. We had a situation, and I'll own part of this, where the Attorney General kept hiring members of the Open Meeting Commission, and the statute said could only have a state's attorney on that. So I hired a couple, and then one got beat in an election, and so we were always trying to fill it, and the legislature cooperated, and now lets us put deputy state's attorneys on it. So there was a little bit of a backlog, but I'm happy to say they're catching up, and it should be taken care of. So to summarize, there is teeth if you consider it a misdemeanor. You could easily convince me to make it a class 1 misdemeanor, which would be a year to give it more teeth. I like the idea of having the state's attorney review it first because they know what went on. They were there. It's their county commission. But it also, by going to the Open Meeting Commission, earlier I heard the talk of if it's a conflict, it might be hard in your local community for the state's attorney to necessarily take action against their county commission. So it goes to an independent Open Meeting Commission. And Larry Long, I don't get the credit for that. Larry Long gets the credit for helping form that with the legislature. So it's a good program. And that, again, that's putting out information and educating. I think that arguably 2 or 4 years ago, that commission was not doing what it needed to be doing. And I think it is now, and it's fully staffed and loaded and addressing complaints.
So I'm going to respectfully disagree with you on this one, Attorney General Jackley. Our law does not have good teeth in the open meetings law, and we've advocated over the years that there should be the option for a civil lawsuit to be brought by a member of the public or someone for a violation of open meetings law, other than have to go through state attorney. Because until just a few years ago, in the 50-year history of the open meetings law, I was not aware of one state's attorney who ever prosecuted under the criminal penalty of that law. I mean,
We had one, but the judge dismissed it.
that's right. That's what happened there. So, I mean, because obviously state's attorneys are reluctant to take on not only county commissions, but a school board or city council. I mean, that's oftentimes not politically advantageous to do. And so it creates a huge bar and hurdle, I think, politically to get a good, effective treatment of the open meetings law. I think we got a question out here from the audience, if you may, so come on up to the mic here.
Hi, good morning. I also am from the government, and I'm here to help. So I appreciate
Is that the federal
this.
government?
No. So I have a comment and then a question. I've had the privilege of working in really small communities in South Dakota, and often we don't know what we don't know. And I've yet to see any in my tenure of city management any real coordination between the state and the municipal league in just doing some training on what the open meeting laws are, how to unintentionally avoid violating them. I feel like that would be a valuable resource, not just for small communities, but I work in a pretty large one now. My question is related to serial meetings. And I understand if there's a quorum that is involved. But what I've seen happen, and I, as someone who is advising an elected body, an intentional non-quorum, and then I'm going to go grab a couple other people in an intentional non-quorum meeting. And I don't know how to advise if that is, I mean, I don't think it's right, but is it a violation of the law? And what do we need to do to make sure that those types of discussions are being transparent?
You know, you say, is it a violation of the law? And you see it in here. The Attorney General generally has taken the position that if it's questionable or for openness, it is a requirement. If you're intentionally trying to circumvent something, I think it's a problem, and I think the Open Meeting Commission probably would take action. And it's okay for us to disagree on the teeth. I mean, if you guys would bring it to a Class 1 misdemeanor, you'd have me all over that. I don't know if I could get it passed, but I would be supportive of that. David Wheeler and that group would probably give it its fair day. But you hold the power on. If you were to call out that type of conduct, whether it be on radio, in the newspaper, on TV, you have a greater effect and influence than, frankly, that state's attorney does on a misdemeanor that probably is not going to result in jail time, that the judge is going to take the position they have different things to do and dismiss it. But on what you described, I feel, and I don't speak, I get to appoint on the Open Meeting Commission, I get to assign them a lawyer and pay for everything that they do, but I don't get a say in it. I do believe they probably say, the minute you said intentionally trying to circumvent, would likely say it's a violation. I think they'd be looking at what the mens rea is or what the intent is. And, you know, before I was Attorney General, I've been Hawken County State's Attorney, Jones County State's Attorney. I've been brought in to represent a lot of school boards. And I always say this, I mean, the minute you start to take action to circumvent openness, people start asking a whole bunch of questions. And you might try to do it for efficiency or trying to get something done quicker. Just be open about it. The minute you're open about it, I think a lot of these issues go away, and it comes back to education. But yeah, I would encourage, don't try to find circumventing and loopholes, because I think it just catches up with you. And I know every member on that commission, because now I've appointed all 5 of them, and I don't think they would take kindly to hearing a fact scenario where, well, maybe we were dancing on the line of the law, but we were intentionally trying to avoid having a quorum. I think they probably would result in a public reprimand.
Thank you.
Yep.
I think a good law in South Dakota would be to require that every agency board that falls under the open meetings law shall, as part of its organizational meeting every year, review the open meetings law. That they have they have to appoint their official newspaper, they got to appoint their official depository, their attorney. Well, then they're going to take 30 minutes to review the law as well with their attorney as well. I think that would be good mandatory training.
I would support that with one exception, and I was talking to Carson about this. Once you hit 50, I don't know that you can read this. You guys got to make this bigger.
Todd, question here.
Yeah, Marty, thanks for coming. So, I'm going to be careful how I phrase this. I'm not trying to get you in trouble. So, in a Marty Jackley gubernatorial administration, what changes would you propose be made to South Dakota's open records and open meeting laws?
That's a fair question, but let me answer it as Attorney General, because that's what I am now. Dave knows this. I'm big on task forces, because when I was a young, naive Attorney General, I thought if the governor and the Newspaper Association and some legislators would get together and study this and propose it, that should be a no-brainer. And boy, was I wrong. We got kicked around hard. And I personally came and testified, and at the time the Chief of Staff came and testified. It wasn't like we ignored it. I would like to see, and we've talked about it, and we kind of did a little bit last time, I'd like to see a task force study it. And, you know, my direction always is I will go to bat if it's reasonable. I think we have to do something with the executive session. I see abuse after abuse. I don't know what that is. I mean, we have to be able, you know, the city attorney has to be able to go in and talk to the city council about whether you want to settle this for $15,000 or $200,000, and you know that from your law experience. There's just some things we have to do, or an employee deal where it's a touchy employee situation. That has to be behind closed doors. But I see complaint after complaint, and I've seen it as a lawyer where you're in executive session doing something appropriate, and then the next conversation comes up, and it's like, well, wait a minute here. That isn't anticipated litigation. That isn't an employee situation. That isn't a trade secret situation. That's not a bid. This isn't. We need a motion to get out of here, and some of that's education, and I think you could statutorily fix that a little bit. I think we're to the point on the courts where we made a good, you know, we had a summer study. Chief Justice Gilbertson was very supportive of it. We got headway in the South Dakota Supreme Court. We got good laws to allow certain things to happen in a courtroom. I think it's time to revisit that, and maybe a party shouldn't be able to just shut that down. Maybe it becomes a discretion of the judge, but it's just not a complete veto. I think that would be something I would change. And then I like the idea about if you're going to serve on a state entity or you're going to serve on a political subdivision, you should have to be familiar with the open meeting and open record laws. And then lastly, I mean, I think that summer study or task force needs to look at those exceptions. There's a lot of exceptions in law there. And just see if, I mean, some of them maybe are still valid, but I do struggle with it. You know, there's a presumption of openness, but yet we have every exception in the book. But I don't need to be running for governor to do that. I could do that as Attorney General, and I think it's time again to take a look at some of these. And we have taken baby steps. Every time we do this commission stuff or task force, we get a little bit of headway, and I think it's time to do it again.
Thank you. I mean, mugshots, a baby step, right? We got that done, though. I mean, it took some work, but we finally got, you know, mugshot booking photos are public record in South Dakota.
I can't call them mugshots anymore. I get in trouble. I got to call booking photos.
So I'm glad to hear you talk about executive sessions, because the majority of questions I get from reporters and editors who are frustrated by open meetings law, what they perceive to be violations of the law, relate to an executive session type topic, and it's a tough one to deal with. I get that. But we do have a question that came across the chat related to that. What about interviewing candidates for a job in executive session? Cities got to hire someone for this position, and now they're going to interview everyone in executive session. Permissible or not?
Yeah, if you look at that employee exception, again, it depends on what you're doing. I would say it could be permissible under certain circumstances. If it's you're interviewing an employee that it's clearly employment related and it will cost them their other job, I think you can make an argument that it fits within that exception. Now, that's pretty rare. I don't think you would want to make it the usual. But if you came in and said, all right, I'll make it up. We're the city of Sioux Falls, and we're going to interview the state's attorney for the city attorney job. There's a reason you might not want to make that public, right? There's no job offer out there. I understand it's not an employee yet, but it's employment related. So I think that probably could fit the statute. But if you're going to say every employee interview we're going to do is behind closed doors like that, I think that could be a problem.
I've run into instances where a local board is looking to fill a vacancy on that board. It's on its own board, and they're taking candidates for that position in executive session. Probably, I always say that should be a no-no in terms of, I mean, the board's trying to fill a vacancy on its own board, and it's interviewing the candidates for that position in executive session. I think that's really kind of goes too far.
Well, and that happened recently in the Sturgis area. You know, there was a lot of controversy over that, and again, you know, some of that controversy would have gone away if they would have opened it up for further discussion. So in other words, maybe some of the things that happen could go in executive session, but at some point, the candidates for that, in an open discussion forum, need to be able to be heard in the public. There may have been a couple of questions appropriate for executive session. So as you know, you go into executive session, you talk about the sensitive, appropriate, confidential things you can under executive session, and then you leave executive session, and then you open it up for public discussion. But again, some of it's just going to depend upon what the topic is and what the issue is. And we do that when we get complaints in the office, and we do get a lot of these complaints. We want to know is, well, what was actually being discussed? What was happening? In the minute, like was discussed before, we find out, well, it's an intentional, circumvention of the rules, then that's when we say, get it to the state's attorney to review for criminal action and then send it to the Open Meetings Commission.
Thank you. I back to the problems of executive session law as it is today. I think the answer lies in terms of doing some fixes to that is the actual language that allows for those exceptions. I think that language some of that language, particularly when it comes to personnel and to financial issues and to quote legal issues, needs to be tightened, reworked. I think that's where the answer lies in terms of trying to redo the executive session. But anytime you open that up in terms of a possible bill and peer, it brings everyone out because everyone's affected by that, right? I mean, political subdivisions, state government, Board of Regents down to the Heights City Council, the open meetings law applies, right? So, it gets everyone nervous when you talk about executive sessions.
It does, and I'm extra sensitive to this because in small towns, sometimes, these are all oftentimes volunteer positions, and it's sometimes hard to get these positions filled. And then if you start putting in a bunch of, well, we're going to prosecute you for this and that, and we're going to do these certain things, you're going to get people that don't want to serve, and you're going to affect public service, and we don't want to do that. I think we're better off just educating. But Dave, I fully agree that I think you could look at the executive session criteria and give more clarification. But then everybody needs to understand, if you do that, you could have the other side seek to tighten things or to loosen things further. And so that's why if you're going to do it, you need to have a task force. You need to have legislative horsepower on that task force and have everybody there to have a good discussion of what would make our laws stronger and not affect volunteer service on all across our state. And I think you could get that done. But you also have to recognize you could have people trying to do certain amendments that would actually limit openness, and I've seen that before.
So be careful what you ask for. Question here. Come on up.
I cover an interesting variety of public entities. I live in Dakota Dunes, but I cover Union County as well as North Sioux City. But I also cover Dakota Dunes Community Improvement District. Does that qualify as a public entity, or is that considered a private entity? Since I guess to me it's a housing development, and do they have to follow public or open meeting laws like say North Sioux City?
So you'd have to look at their actual charter. It goes back to what we first started talking about. Are they exercising sovereign power? Are they the state? Are they a political subdivision of the state that exercises any sovereign power? So I'll use an example. Back when I lived in Rapid City, when I'm part of a homeowners association dealing with covenants, not likely. But if you start to get into an entity that does exercise certain sovereign powers, one of those powers can be condemnation, right? Sanitary districts.
Yeah.
So I would want to know from the chart, what exactly are they doing? If they're exercising any sovereign power, then yeah, they're subject to those. If they're doing certain types of business, we already got into task forces and other things. There's certain things entities can do that don't necessarily trigger the openness requirements.
Okay, yeah, they manage utilities, streets, things like that, and there's a separate homeowners association.
So if they're managing it and they're exercising that sovereign power, then I always side with, then you're required to follow those rules.
Okay, all right. My next, I have another question. Union County, the Union County Commission. I've covered county commissions in 4 other states over the years. And this is the first time I've ever seen a county commission actually have built in an executive session into their agenda. It's a permanent agenda item, and it's always built into towards the bottom of their agenda every single meeting. And sometimes they have more than one executive session. And back in November, or maybe it was October, I can't remember, they spent 50% of their meeting in executive session. There were 2 other executive sessions that they had, impromptu ones. Now, I find that highly unusual, just based on the other towns that I've covered throughout the years in Minnesota, Nebraska, and Iowa, and but other places I've known, they had a specific procedure they went through when they went into executive session, and always there was a county attorney present when they went into executive session, and these times, seldom is there a county attorney present. Once in a while there is. Is there supposed to be a procedure that they go through when somebody goes into executive session? And are they supposed to have a roll call vote, et cetera, like that, in both going into and coming out of executive session?
So let me just, and our laws are loose on all this. And some of this is best practices, but I would tell you the law does permit you to put executive session on the agenda. Doesn't mean you have to use it. In other words, I'm guessing there's instances when they never go into executive session.
I haven't seen it.
The normal protocol to go into executive session is a motion, a second, a vote. Doesn't have to be a roll call vote. You go into executive session, you discuss matters. They have to be of the criteria listed in the statute. There does not have to be a lawyer present.
Okay.
Now, is it a good idea if you're going to discuss anticipated litigation in executive session to have a lawyer there? Yeah, because again, it's a perception issue, but you don't necessarily. It could have been a deal where the lawyer couldn't make it and the lawyer's got a letter for them to consider on a settlement of something for $10,000 versus $15,000. So it's not required. You dang well can't take any action in executive session other than a vote to go out of executive session. You can't do any business in executive session. You can discuss it. You can even get a consensus of where you think it might go. But you have to go out of executive session. And when you go out of executive session, again, you have to vote on that. It's not a roll call vote. But that's how that generally works. But there can't be any motions in executive session. Really, in the proper protocol is you leave executive session, and in the public is the motion to go out of executive session, and it's voted on. That's how you should do it. Should not be tape recording executive session. That can get you further jammed up, but that's the protocol.
We're going to have to cut it off there so we can move on to our next session. But absolutely very good topic, and I'm sure Marty would be willing to discuss it further with
Absolutely.
you if you want to, Gary, as well. But listen, Marty, it's 45, 50 minutes, gone very fast. It's been good, but we covered a lot of ground. Thank you very much for coming in for the discussion this morning.
Thank you for letting us be a part of it. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm just going to quickly put a plug in for SD.net and all of the boards and commission meetings that are audio version that are posted at SD.net live as they happen. So don't forget that there is that resource. If you can't make it to the meeting, you can listen to it online.
Got somebody who's synonymous with open government in South Dakota, John Arneson. He practices in Sioux Falls, but he is definitely has stayed up on this for a long time. Veteran status, I think, right now. Yeah, I think I gotta flip on the mic there. Yeah, we were talking about it, that he's almost 50 years into it here. Yeah, I know we're talking about the small font today here on a lot of us there. So
I was trying to read that open, the new brochure in the back. It's just, even with reading glasses.
yeah, I know. And all those anti-50-year-olds, ageism is alive and well. Okay, once you hit 50, okay, it's like we'll be file a lawsuit on
Yeah,
that.
Marty was saying, well, anything over 50, and I just realized in 2 years I come up on 50 years of doing this work.
Oh, that's great.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, I started when I was 1.
Yeah, that's right. Early law school there. So, well, I just appreciate John coming. It was great getting to reconnecting with him over this, because I think of one case in particular. It was a court case where, I was told I couldn't have documents, and sure enough, you went all the way to the Supreme Court and got the court to reprimand and tell the judge, no, you can't just shut things out. So just one follow-up on what we just heard. I think a lot of it is really we as reporters, members of the public, but also we've got to initiate that. And I thought Dave said something very important too, and that is go introduce yourself to those local entities. If we're an unknown entity, the chances of them, being open and proactive and getting you information is smaller than if we as journalists understand the law, but also develop those relationships. You're still going to butt heads with them, but I think that's one thing that I've learned over the years is those personal relationships. John, we're going to talk a little bit briefly, but get your questions. If you're in journalism, John's a really good resource, so be thinking of some of that. We're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A there. So, John, just in looking at that 50 years, how are we? How has it been? Is it better, worse? We talked a little bit about a lot of the challenges that you've gone through.
Well, it's a lot better. Well, it's better. A lot might be a stretch. But when I first started doing this, Keith Jensen was the SDNA guy, and I think my very first experience was meeting the new staff of the Argus Leader when Gannett bought them out. And they brought in new people, and I happened to run into the editor. And I know you don't really care that much about my history, but this is how I started doing this. It's really early in my career, and journalism had always been, I'd actually gone to graduate school in journalism, so it's always been there that's really what I wanted to be, was a newspaper person. This lawyer stuff was not really for me. But, so there I was, stuck as a lawyer, and I met Larry Fuller, and I rather glibly said, so when is the Argus Leader going to start running Doonesbury? And I was just being a jerk. Because I thought, back in those days, Doonesbury was very topical and very funny. This is like 1978. And he remembered my snarky comment. And the next time they had an issue, which was like a few weeks later, they called me, and I took over the Argus business, so to speak. I was never in-house counsel, but that's how I got started going down the path, sort of, that I really wanted to be in the first place. So I got to kind of combine the representing journalists in a way to help them be better at what they do, and that was the open government aspect of things. A lot of it in the early days was libel, but back in the early 80s, the United States Supreme Court had some libel cases that kind of slam dunked everything for the newspaper defendant. We kind of won the day. So then the approach began to be more access, open meetings and open records. And when I started, the open records law in our state, and I'm not blaming the legislature for this, but you can imagine the three branches of government, the judiciary pretty much has stayed the same. We have maybe 10 judges in the Second Circuit now rather than 3, but essentially the judiciary stays pretty much the same, our two-tier system. The legislature, there may be more people there now than there were back in 1920, but essentially that sort of stays the same size. It's the executive branch that has expanded exponentially in the last 150 years. And the problem with that was our old open records law actually said you are entitled to have, essentially, I'm not quoting verbatim, but we were allowed access to records of government if there was a specific reference in a statute that said that's an open record. Now, mind you, what might have been in the executive branch as a record in 1920, 100 years later, now we've got probably 1,000 times as many types of records. We have probably 10 times as many agencies. We didn't keep up. So our legislature fell way, way, way behind in what we needed to have access to our, as Marty said, what we own. I mean, or what David said earlier on the first presentation, those are our records. And we weren't able to get them. So then Marty also referred to us progressing, and Dave Bordewick, through baby steps. Well, actually, we progressed through going, I wouldn't say backwards, but getting hammered in court several times in a row. We knew we had to take these issues on, and we had to fight a law that was antiquated. And we did from 1980 to 2009. It took that long, but we kept losing. But I had to keep hoping that the Supreme Court of the state would eventually say, yeah, we see your point. But most of the time they said, hey, our hands are tied. Where you should be is arguing up in front of the legislature to get the law changed. And I'm not a lobbyist, so I wasn't really involved in that process. But eventually, I think the fact that we were making legitimate requests, whether it's the governor's hunt or Governor Jankelow's pardons, those kinds of things, I think we were so legitimate in what we were trying to do that finally the legislature, bipartisan, Republican, Dave Knudsen, and Democrat Nancy Turbach, were the proponents or sponsors of legislation that gave us our current open records law. So this happened in 2009. They tried it in 2008. It didn't pass. But essentially what David Knudsen did, and with Nancy's help, excuse me, is drafted a law that borrowed heavily from the state of Nebraska. Essentially, we copied the state of Nebraska, almost all of it. And sometimes it's, why reinvent the wheel if it's already there? And Nebraska had a pretty good open records law. But curiously, what happened in the course of doing that is our legislature made some interesting changes. And I don't even know, to this day, David, when did you start as the head of SDNA? 96. Yeah, so you and I never really have quite figured out whether some of the changes that were made from the Nebraska law to our law were intentional or just mistakes. And to this day, I don't know, but they are on the books. And I'll just give you a quick example. And this is, this business is fraught with problems. And one of them is interpreting interpretations of the law. And every single word in these statutes can be significant. And the problem, for example, one of the, of course, we have now the presumption that all the records, let's just stick with the executive branch. All the records in the executive branch are open records. It's a presumption, right, that we have right of access unless there's an exception. So we've reversed that rather than having the presumption be, hey, you prove to us that there's a statute that says this is open. Now we have the presumption at least, but these exemptions, the list of them has gone, I think we're up to 27 now. But the one that really intrigues me is Nebraska had one that said personal information basically in an state employee's file. Personal information is exempt from the open records law. And that makes sense. I mean, if your employee application or whatever indicates your religion, or, questions now you can't even ask, but personal information that has nothing to do with your role in government. I can see that. That makes sense. However, by the time we enacted our law in 2009, that word personal got changed to personnel. So now we have an exception number, well, I'm not going to fool around with it. Basically says you are going to get what's in a person's, an employee's file, and it's limited to what they do and how much money they make, essentially. And so everything that deals with their job is protected. You can't get it. And that definitely is not the it's not the objective of our law. The objective of our law is to keep private what should be private. I mean, we don't need to know what you do in your bedrooms. We don't need to know what church you go to. We do need to know what you're doing when you're working for us. You're a public servant. Now, that's one example. And then to make matters even more interesting, another one of those exemptions allowed for the communications, the emails, telephone calls, and stuff of legislators to be exempt. Not the executive branch, just legislators. That was the Nebraska model. By the time we passed our law, we took off the legislative limitation, and now that law applies across the board. So that's why all of us, and when our first presenter was talking about, well, now you need to be more specific, and he did a wonderful job, but this is how sometimes why we might rank really low on the list, 48, 49 out of 50. When you ask for an email of anybody in state government or city government or county government, have you ever gotten it? No, because it's exempt. They're telephone calls or emails, that correspondence, and it doesn't have to relate to personal matters. It's across the board exclusion, which essentially means we don't know a lot about what these people do sometimes. My concern is that I think we have a philosophical issue. I think a lot of people who are in state government, and I'll exclude Marty from this, but I think that they can talk a better game than they want to play. And I think philosophically they do not see this as ours. They do not see themselves as, quote, public servants. And I don't like the word servant, public service, really, but they're working for us. They may not have been elected, but they represent us, and everything they do is ours in their work. And that has been the really frustrating thing for me in the last 50 years, is the victories come once in a while, but for the most part, I sometimes go in expecting to lose, hoping to make progress, because someone will realize what a bad loss that is, and that that's not the way things should work. And we're better off in 2009. I know we're now 2024. We were better off in 2009 than we were in 1980, but we still have a long, long way to go. And I would say the same thing with the open meetings as well. There have been some really bizarre instances in which, the 5 or now 6 reasons to go into executive session have been abused. And as Marty and David were talking about, our language needs to be tuned up. Things need to be tightened up. And the problem is we have a part-time legislature. Most of them really don't care or know that much about open records and open meetings because it doesn't really affect them that much. And to educate them is difficult. They have a lot of other business on their agenda, and this doesn't seem like it's all that important to them. We somehow need to get these people aware that it is important to us. And I'm not saying that 40,000 people in a 50,000 member community are all excited about open records and open meetings, but I think if they were to realize what they're not getting, you know, when it begins to affect them, then they're going to understand that this is important stuff and they need to do something about it. And it doesn't mean running to a lawyer. I do a lot of the stuff I do pro bono because I want to make sure people or newspapers or media have some accessibility to getting these things done. But I also am very cognizant of the fact that you people in journalism, you've got to go on to the next day. And sometimes these things, I'm not saying they fall through the cracks, but you just don't have time to devote to continuing to make them an issue. The ones we pick out and try to make an issue, I guess, are the ones we think are going to be significant enough to have some impact or some future ramifications that are helpful to us as a whole. But again, I'm not advocating anarchy. I'm simply trying to have a government that's responsive to us. We need to be informed to know what's going on because it's our government. And number two, it's the accountability issue. We may not be a corrupt state, but we've had plenty of instances of corruption, have we not? And some of those might not have happened had we had better access to what was going on.
I'm going to need you to put the mic a little closer to your mouth so our online audience can hear a little better.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that does make a difference, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, it's all been brilliant so far.
That segues nicely with the question I had, that regardless of the law, because I think we've identified in the earlier sessions and here that there are things legislatively and maybe at higher levels that need to be done at that high level. But from a frontline journalist standpoint, what's the best thing that they can do? They're hopefully covering school board, city council, county commission, maybe they're going to the legislature, they're governing the planning committee. What could they do to arm themselves with information and then pay attention and look for those opportunities where there might be violations of accountability? Can they call you? But just from that day in and day out beat, what are some things that they should be thinking?
Well, they certainly can call. I mean, I am kind of the hotline person for the media or for Dave's association, but educating themselves is certainly important. And then being graciously aggressive. Yeah, I mean, obviously it seems to be a oxymoron, but persistent might be a better word, but without being, without nagging, know what you're talking about and present it in a logical, reasonable way and try to make some headway that way. I'm not saying it's going to work. I mean, it often doesn't work for me either. So, it's not a panacea, but it's don't just take no, and be a little bit stubborn and be persistent. But also know what it does help to know the law. And I mean, you don't have to go to law school. Quite honestly, law school doesn't teach us how to read statutes. Law school is a whole different approach. You can read these statutes as well as I can, and you can understand that you may not have the same awareness of how it applies across the board because of other case law, which are court opinions, but you can read these statutes as well as I can and say, hey, wait, that doesn't mean that, or that word should be interpreted this way. And I mean, you have that capability certainly as well as anybody. So I would say be educated about what the law seems to say and then use that, because the people you're talking to probably know less than you do about what the law says.
Good advice. That's excellent. Any questions in house or from a distance? Otherwise, I got more. All right, come on, y'all. We got good opportunity here. What are some examples, maybe some success and some that did not go well over the past couple of years, or past 50 years, but just examples of cases, either in the court system, because one of the big things that we went through is a period of gag orders and kind of closing down that. I think those have largely gone away. But the court system and open government are two, and what we're talking about here are two areas. And so, any anecdotes that come to mind that went well or did not go well?
Well, I think we began to have a little bit of success in the early 2000s. Up until that, but essentially what we needed was the 2009 law in terms of records, and I think that sort of resolved a certain number of issues. I guess in terms of open meetings, I'm still a little bit concerned about that whole process. I appreciate the fact that we have an open meetings commission. I know that they were running out of time. I would like to ask Marty, even though I know that it's a legislative enactment that created this with Larry Long's help. I would like to see that Open Meetings Commission not just be 5 state's attorneys. Now, I'm not saying that state's attorneys have a bias, but I think I would like to see a different balance and maybe add a couple of members who come from the media. Now, I realize that you might say, well, wait a minute, they're not lawyers, they're interpreting the law. Well, in a sense, by the time something gets to the Open Meetings Commission, it's been passed on by the state's attorney as not something he or she wishes to prosecute. And again, I know, and I appreciate that Marty would say, yeah, I'd be happy to up the penalty for meetings violation from 30 days to a year, from a Class 2 to a Class 1 misdemeanor. But let's go back to the original. He and Dave agreed only one case ever got prosecuted, and that got tossed. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. One might as well have the death penalty for this. It's not going to make any difference if they're never prosecuted. So I don't think you're going to have a lot of prosecutions for that. It just seems like draconian in a sense, because they're going to say, well, that's kind of what that commission is for. But then the commission can only really slap their hands and maybe, hopefully, I'm hopeful, educate that body from not doing the same thing again. But in terms of that, since it's not really it doesn't have the imprimatur of a judicial decision in that, in it more than a slap on the hand, kind of the government accountability board type thing, which we can talk about too. It seems to me that, maybe a couple of different philosophies might blend in well with that commission and make it maybe, you might get a different decision now and then. I've had good decisions and bad decisions.
Question that came in from online: can a local government require all public records requests be sent through U.S. mail based on their county policy? No informal requests, emailed requests are allowed. It has to be through the U.S. mail.
I think that probably is something that could well be litigated at some point, because I don't think there's an answer. And I think the thing about the portal that came up in the very first session, we now have a portal, as we know, and within the last month, one of the people that I've done some work for was given a response from the spokesperson for our governor that said, we're going to treat your request for this information as informal, and if you want to have a formal official request, which we have to do to trigger the OHE, or the Office of Hearing Examiners, or the court process, please go through the portal and have the link. So I've looked at the portal, and they do have forms that they want you to use and all that sort of thing. No, it's not law. But, you know, how long do you want to take litigating whether that's the right procedure or not? And therein lies the rub. You know, you just sometimes need to kind of go ahead, accept the bad, and try to find some good out of it. So I would say for now, that's maybe, if they're saying we want it in writing, give it to them in writing. I mean, yes, it has to be that way sometimes, but an email attachment is not writing. Come on, people. Of course it is. But yet, I've also come across that recently, in which one of my clients was told by, again, and this time it was the governor's office, the attorney in the governor's office, saying, we don't respond to email, essentially, you know. And yet, when I went back and looked at the file, she had attached a letter to an email, and that was the way she communicated. But, you know, what's good for the goose is not always good for the gander. So, but we also have an administration that is on record for saying it's going to be the most transparent administration in the history of South Dakota. And see how that has worked out for you.
All right. Anybody else in the audience here? We have a couple of folks from city government, but then also we have just a lot of regular folks from the general public who signed up for this as well, which is awesome. If they're not a journalist, well, number one, why should they be concerned about this? And what are some things maybe that they can do at the local level? I remember covering city commission here in South Dakota, or in Sioux Falls, when I was a cub reporter, and Ralph and Dutch, if anybody covered them, remember they were there for every meeting. And I think Dutch was the vocal one, would always speak for Ralph. And the two of them kept those commissioners on their feet. You know, they asked questions. They were there every Monday evening. And so you don't have that anymore, I don't think, in every jurisdiction. But do things change if more people realize that it's their government, it's their taxes that are being affected by that lack of lucidity?
I guess everybody has their own breaking point. At what point do they see something that offends them, their sensibilities, their sense of what the way things should be done, even if it doesn't affect them personally. Now, typically, you get people interested in access and government things if it affects them personally. Like, okay, they're going to repair my sidewalk, but they're going to assess me, $500,000, or, I want a hunting license, or, those kinds of things. And I can't fault people for not being, alert or interested in all the rest of it. So yeah, it's nice to have those kind of government watchdogs. But otherwise, I guess all I can say is it's just a matter of wanting your government to be more receptive. Whether it's, and this is not a partisan thing. I mean, it just so happens that in South Dakota we haven't had a Democratic governor since early 1970. But that's not, the Democrats are probably just as likely to be covering up records as Republicans. So I'm not condemning one party or the other. I'm simply saying all of government can be better for all of us. And I think as citizens, even if it doesn't affect you personally, you might, particularly in this day and age when, we have such division in this country, you might want to make sure that we protect what's important, and that is knowing what's going on. If we don't, we're really in trouble, and I think that's what journalism is really designed to do, is to help keep the public informed. And as journalism and newspapers I'm not saying journalism is dying, but it's not getting better. The death of newspapers is one of the most traumatic things I've experienced in my professional life. So it might depend more upon each individual than the actual, quote, formal media. Otherwise, you may lose a lot of what you normally get. I mean, I'll be frank, I really miss print media. I really do. And, you know I'm old, but, and I don't mind getting news on my computer, but I really preferred my actual newspaper. I miss it. But then that's each to his own. I can't, claim that every member, every citizen needs to be out there rallying, for open government. But I think it is important, and I think you would really miss it if it was gone.
Well put. Any question?
Okay, thank you for the discussion once again. I've really been interested in the access barriers you've been identifying, especially relating to open government. It could be age, it could be eyesight, it could be intellectual capacity. So there are all sorts of access barriers to information. And I was wondering if you have any suggestions for how we tear them down. So how do we remove those access barriers so people can understand that, number one, we do need an open government, we do need access to that information, and how do we essentially make that happen? So,
Boy,
did I give you an easy question?
no, I just think I don't know that I have any answer for that other than, I mean, I think what you're asking is, how do we, what's the best way to educate people?
Yeah, I think that's the best start.
Well, first, you have to get their interest, right? And I think, sadly, I've sort of been implying it without really stating it. One way to get people's interest is to have things go wrong. And when you have extreme examples of bad decisions, that's what gets the people's attention. That's why our open records law got changed. After the open records law got changed, and I know Carson might want more specific examples, but after we had the 2009 open records change, I ended up with a case that involved the interpretation of one of the exceptions that dealt with settlements, settlements that in this case, it happened to be the city of Sioux Falls entered into a settlement on the Denny Sanford Premier Center. I don't know if you remember when it was constructed, there were dents and stuff, and there were lawsuits threatened and all sorts of things. And there was a confidential settlement agreement with the contractors. And the Argus leader, I think it was the Argus at that time, we tried to get that information and were denied that information, ended up going to the state Supreme Court, and they interpreted the exception that the city was using to keep that information away from us. They interpreted that favorably to us, but it was a very technical, a lot of lawyers out there in the state, while they weren't making fun of the decision, they said they'd never seen a Supreme Court decision quite like that, because my whole argument was based on grammar. And, it was a winning argument, thank goodness, but that's how important these things can be and how technical they can be. But you don't have to be a genius or, a linguist to be able to have your own right interpretation. And I think the more people get involved with that, the better off we are. Now, I don't know, I can't say that if you offer a course, people are going to come, but, just be as kind to them as you can in trying to explain what's going on. So.
Todd?
John, I have kind of a law school exam question for you. I'm just trying to put a couple things together. So let's say the city council in Sioux Falls is talking about tax increment financing for a project downtown, which they do all the time. And let's say that four of the councilors are emailing each other back and forth about that issue. And I'm like, should we approve it? Should we not approve it? So on the one hand, it sounds like an open meeting violation, but on the other hand, if they're conducting it via email, do I, as a journalist, have a right to get it, even though it looks like they're conducting public business via email?
It's probably time I actually find that, so I don't
You know it's old school when he's using a binder and a legal pad.
I want to find the exact exceptions so I don't misquote. But yeah, you've got a problem in proving the violation because you can't get the record to prove the
Right.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a real conundrum how you would break through that. I don't have an answer for you.
Okay.
Other than we need to get the legislature to understand that's a problem. You cannot shield all these workplace emails, telephone calls from the public unless they're personal. And that's not what the law says right now. So all of it is restricted. I really should find the actual statute exception, because we now, when I told you we changed that word personal to personnel, in the meantime, when we also were changing this application of the exemption for legislators to be across the board for emails and telephone calls and that sort of thing, two other parts of our 27 exceptions use the word, there's an exception for anything that's too personal, essentially. So personal is used 3 times in the exceptions, except in the one spot where it belongs, which is really frustrating because it shows me that the legislature is not really paying attention to this. And again, they do have a lot of other things that probably in their frame of mind are more important. But it still is frustrating for those of us who need to battle these semantic problems.
So what would you suggest in that situation? So let's say somebody from city government tips me off, hey, the mayor and 4 councilors are having this discussion. I've heard about it. Maybe I've seen some of the emails. I can't get them to you, but they're there. So how would you proceed as a journalist? Do I have to go to court and sue them?
I would take what you have and write about it, number one. And, if you go to court, that might be the kind of the court case that triggers the change in the legislation. I mean, that's all I could recommend. Because
and would you take it pro bono?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm happy to do things pro bono. I do now kind of draw a line. I really want cases that I think are really winnable, because otherwise I'm wasting everybody's time and resources, including my own. And I'm in Los Angeles a lot now, so, I don't want to be coming back here for court appearances when I'm going to get my ass kicked.
Okay, last question here, we'll take it. Is it accurate to say that South Dakota law enforcement agencies have full discretion over what is publicly released, like videos, probable cause affidavits, incident reports? And then what do you think of Marty Jackley's statement that the AG says local agencies can decide whether to release videos? I mean, why would they in cases where it may implicate them?
That's really beyond what I would be comfortable even expressing an opinion on. I don't really know. I don't have a good answer for that. And Marty's still here, so I'm not going to say anything.
Okay. Well, John, thank you so much. He's been this calming voice several times over my career. It's like, okay, here's the pickle I'm in. What do I do? And John was the other side. I think
I'll tell you, it's we've lost a lot, but we've actually had a lot of fun because some of the stuff has been really, really interesting. From, as I said, pheasant hunt to governmental pardons and all that kind of stuff. And, we just need to kind of keep banging on the door and hope it will open a little bit more each time.
Yeah.
And not have a window open in the back where there's where they're throwing the stuff out the back window.
Right.
So,
Well, I
anyway.
appreciated what you said too. Graciously aggressive, I think, and that goes back to what I said earlier, that, it really comes down to our people skills. I mean, journalism, your number one skill should be people skills, in terms of getting along. And I think sometimes if we put up a fight before we try to, get along and make a respectful, request of things. And so I think that's one thing. And so John is available. I really appreciate you coming by. Good interaction today. So-
And nothing wrong with developing good confidential sources.
Oh yeah. It is.
Confidentiality is not maybe what we really want. I mean, because I think journalism also, that's kind of the way you have to go. But, we also want to be transparent, right? As transparent as we can be. But if you can find people who will talk to you,
That helps.
and they're legitimate and they're, credible, that's something to have. So.
Yeah. John, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it. All right. Well, Kara's going to join me. We are going to talk about something that is her brainchild. This is something that we talked about around a year or so ago. And it is called Vote South Dakota. I'm going to let her kind of go over the genesis of the idea of it and begin to. Are you going to sit? You're going to stand.
I'll stand. I'll
Okay.
stand. So we're going to hand out a few handouts for you. This is something that Carson and I were talking about is how can we as the media really join forces together and work together on some projects. And so we came up with the Vote South Dakota project, and special thanks to Dave and the News Media Association and Steve with the Broadcasters Association for partnering with this project. And it's really two things. One is a content sharing platform, a Dropbox, so to speak, where you can share your stories and take stories that you need and use that to really beef up your statewide coverage. And to share that. The other is votesouthdakota.com, which is a website, the public-facing website where all of those stories would be posted, but also a way for voters to really have access to open government, to election-related stuff. So this is really focusing on the 2024 election. And there are hopes that this will continue to be a content sharing opportunity going forward, and also really looking ahead to 2026. So let's get the bugs worked out, the workflows worked out, all of the concerns worked out. So there's some civics things that will be on this website. There's the website. It's pretty thin right now because we're just starting the content sharing side. So there's a lot of dreams for going forward. Carson is really going to help oversee getting the content from the shared side of this to the website, and really work with Josh at SDPB and Todd from Broadcasters Association and Austin from Broadcasters Association to help transfer that content over to this website. And I will keep track of those who want to sign an agreement and play in the sandbox and have regular communication and regular ideas. A couple of things that we're hoping is that we are working with another organization to create an interactive legislative map, and every state legislative candidate, after they're declared on the ballot in June, would be interviewed and profiled on this interactive map. That's going to take the whole statewide news media to help contribute and share that content. The other thing is September 19th, a televised town hall debate. This is a 2-hour block, and this is really opening up for statewide candidates. And ballot initiatives is kind of where we're at now to just kind of test that water. What does this 2-hour block look like? How are we a lot yet to be worked out for who's going to host panels, what media organizations are going to want to step up and really be involved and tell those stories. One other piece is that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has a widget through America Amplified, which is Ask Us, Tell Us About It. And I believe that's on there. I have a question. And you can submit your question. Anybody can submit their question. And it will go through the America Amplified. If it's a really easy question, it's on the Secretary of State's website. They're going to handle responding. But if it's a story idea, if it's a pitch, it'll go out to all of the media partners who are willing to. Somebody can pick up that story and do it, and then we'll post it. John Smith from Puckwana wanted to know this, and here's the answer. And so it can be done in a whole lot of different ways. So it's the questions coming in, it's the content that we're sharing, it's the public-facing website. What did I forget?
No, you totally nailed it. And I guess just a couple of things already in place where I think this is not really anything new, but it really builds on a lot of the collaborative efforts already underway in South Dakota. I mean, I'm an old Associated Press guy, right? Well, The Wire isn't too active right now, but the concept with the news cooperative, break the news yourself and then share it with the rest of the state, right? That was so many people in this room, and on the that was how our relationship started, is to be able to do that. So I think it really builds on that. The radio station, I'm looking at JP Skelly here, and God bless our radio folks. There are north of a dozen still, and Jerry Oster, I think, is online from WNAX. We've got a great radio network, and these guys share audio clips among them. Todd Epp, too, for what he did and Austin did for the legislature. The concept being that those sound bites of those interviews with everybody from the governor. I mean, again, Governor Janklow was the power of radio, and sharing that among the listeners. It is a very well used medium in this state, and having public broadcasting being able to use those audio clips on there. Well, if you're a print person or if you're a digital person, those sound bites represent quotes, things that you can convert. And so the idea of being able to use this, if, content is sometimes hard to do. If you think about going into a holiday weekend, we all are over. I mean, the days of us having a full staff of just doing a few things a day it's really over. And so I think what this really does, what Kara's idea of this collaboration really builds on that. And I like the idea of being able to really kind of set aside our competitive nature, and once you've used it, share it from that end, and be able to really build on that, especially going into some of those periods where, and if you think about the genius of being able to get interviews from around the state to really and get to the people again. Sometimes our political coverage is just all with the politicians. They're easy to get a hold of. No offense, Marty. But a lot of times it's those interactions with real people that sometimes we're lacking. And I think if journalists go onto there, you're going to find a lot of those. We use the Google Drive folder. And again, South Dakota News Watch, again, what I'm doing now, a lot of you use our stuff with that same concept. And again, we're trying to beef up our multimedia offerings, but it's the same concept there, that local media do a really good job of covering the local side. I think where this comes in is really building out that statewide footprint and really covering the state without having to do it yourself. We're kind of building on those relationships. And the Google Drive share folder, that's what the Newswatch has used. I haven't had anybody not be able to access it. So I think that from that standpoint, we're still fine tuning the process, but it'll be pretty easy to drop your elements into a shared folder. It'll be curated and then available for fair use from that standpoint.
And really, from a voter aspect, if everybody's content is at one place and JP gets credit for the stories that he does, it's at the top of that, they can still go and noodle around on your website. But it's almost a one-stop shop for voters. And I do have a little bit of money from America Amplified to really promote the website when it comes time for voting. So how do we get this in front of college students? How do we get this statewide? So that is all part of as things cook this summer. But rolling this out in April was a priority. Getting news organizations on board to want to participate is really where our focus is now. And then come June, it will really be about the content, sharing and covering every legislative candidate. And we can be talked into other races if it really brings in a big statewide interest. So this is where we're starting. Any questions from anybody?
Yeah, definitely in person, or if you're from afar, please.
204-0204.
Hi, it's me. So my question is, this looks, first a statement, I think this looks amazing. I think this is a type of collaboration that will be excellent for the state and for all of our access to information. Do you have any plans in terms of how you're going to curate content and users in the age of fake news and pig butchering? What is the mechanism that you're looking for to combat that?
Yeah, known entities. Now, the people doing the curation, some of what they'll be doing is vetting it for accuracy and, is this a legitimate organization? We won't put blogs. We haven't talked about opinion. I don't think you're going to have a lot of opinion pieces on there, but the blessing of being a small state is there's not a ton of news outlets. And so the only ones whose content will be on there have been verified.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, that's a really good question there from that standpoint, because there's a lot of wariness with that. And some of what we'll be doing is just that.
So you have a handout, the front side or a separate side, it depends on where you're at, is just kind of explaining this and explaining the partnership. And now it's time to broaden the partnership. And really open this up to everybody. And then the media agreement is very simple. Not a lot of rules, not a lot of politics. If you want in, you'll get all of the information and all of the access. So filling that out and scanning it to me would be great. And off we go. It's happening.
Yeah, both Kara and my emails are atop that list there. Any questions, reach out from that standpoint. And members of the public, too, who are on there, we appreciate your input, too, as we kind of build this out. Again, the goal really is to, elevate political coverage. It is, and your question is a fair one. Where do you find good, accurate information in this day and age? There's a lot of people, that are selling a bill of goods. And so we're really trying to vet it out and make sure that there is so that there is participation and people have a good source. The Secretary of State's website, and certainly the Attorney General, I don't know if Marty's still here, the Attorney General opinions are always helpful, but what we're going to try to do with this is make them, so they're very understandable, convert this. This is one of the things that I don't think AI can always do is convert the complicated to something that is human and put it in a way that's relatable to voters and make it's like, okay, I don't understand this. And that question and answer, I think I'm looking forward to that. I think that's a really good tool in this day and age where people have questions that we're not even thinking of, and we'll be able to ask that. So there'll be a lot of, just basic shoe leather journalism coming out of this. So thank you all for coming. Again, this is last fall we did some training here. We did Lost in Court. It was a really good session on how to cover state courts. And Marty was gracious enough. Thank you again for Marty and Dave, and for John Arneson and then Dave Coulier. We had a good panel. I think hopefully this was helpful. I know it's 3 hours of your Saturday, but hopefully it was a substantial time spent there. In the fall, we hope to do this again, and we're really trying to get underwriting. You'll see the sponsors there. What we're trying to do is create an environment, and I love the fact that we've got some folks who work in city government here. I know there's some state folks on as well. Thank you so much for being a part of that. It really is trying to create a statewide forum, and that's one of the things that we can do is bring together people who know what they're talking about, have a lively discussion. I think one of the things we have to appreciate is the fact that we're not going to agree. There's going to be a lot of disagreement, but when there is an understanding of what the law, what the rules are, that's where it starts. And with these trainings that we'll do again in the fall, look for that. I will, if you're okay with it, the email that you use to sign up, I'm going to create a database and send it out there just so you're aware of it. But you found out about this one, those same normal channels will be in play there too. But if you would, if there's other topic areas, again, please let us know, because we're really going to try to get underwriting that allows us, thank you, especially to South Dakota Friends of Public Broadcasting, because the studios and all the equipment, the ability to bring this is huge. Kara and her team really went overboard with, in terms of the ability to do this is just awesome there. So look for future trainings in this in the future there. So safe travels to those of you who drove 100 miles or more, and best wishes to everybody. Thanks a lot for coming today.